Congressman, you recently signed a letter that was also penned by 80 of your colleagues, asking the president to address Turkey's backpedaling of this open roadmap relations between Armenia and Turkey. And from our perspective, it looks like it was just a ploy for Turkey to advocate not passing the genocide resolution again. What are your thoughts on this?
I think your read on the situation is absolutely right. I think that we want to make sure that Turkey doesn't backpedal on this, that they don't find excuses not to go forward in the process. And I think it's unfair, especially as Armenia faces a continuing blockade from Turkey and other challenges, also with Azerbaijan, is that you don't need this type of complication and obduracy on the part of the Turkish government. So we wanted to make sure that they understood that although the United States has many pressing international problems, that Armenia remains one of our closest allies, and we are continuing to focus on it, and that we took note of that and found it unhelpful to the process.
Just out of curiosity, when you do address an issue like this to the White House or the administration, do you hear back from any of the policymakers, or is it does it go unnoticed?
No, you will get a standard letter back. It happened under Bush. It happened under President Obama now. The State Department will send a letter. The appropriate people that you sent the letter to will respond. Especially with a new administration, it will take a little more time because it's a big government. They're still getting up and running. So it takes some time to get it back. But these things are very helpful. They're one of the ways Congress, especially in the House, where we have less control of foreign policy by constitutional design, to have our voices heard in a respectful and appropriate and effective manner.
You have a large constituency of Armenians in that area in Michigan, and obviously as important to them as it is for our viewers and our communities out here is the recognition of the Armenian Genocide, and continually administration after administration since the Reagan era, when the president at that time acknowledged genocide, Armenian Americans have been disappointed. What do you think is next in this resolution? And why does Turkey have such a stronghold on this type of a resolution ever passing?
Well, there's two problems, and this is a bipartisan issue where there's bipartisan support for the resolution 252, which I'm an original co-sponsor, and unfortunately there's bipartisan opposition against it. And what we run into is the old strategic view that somehow Turkey is the most critical ally the United States has as an entree point into the Middle East, whereas we've seen events, both tragic and some of them hopeful, supersede that paradigm. It has not been caught up to in Washington. You have entire people in the State Department who've operated on this theory. You have people who will work at the NSA or even they will go across each generationally in terms of policymakers. They'll go from administration to administration. And so it's very hard to get them to understand the new realities of where the United States' relationships are in the region, in the Middle East and elsewhere, and how Turkey in many ways is looking more to the EU than to the United States for its entree into the West. So when you look at it that way, many people are working under an old policy paradigm which is unhelpful to what we're trying to do for the recognition of the truth of what happened with the genocide. But you also then run into the situation where they have a very strong lobby there. And I think that one of the things that is so critical to the success of the Armenian community, even though it's currently frustrated with the status of the recognition, is a tremendous grassroots operation. Tremendous. I first was active with my Armenian community as a state senator. I was able to pass into statute a recognition of the Armenian Genocide in Michigan with their help. And I think that what they do throughout the country to make members aware of the situation, to see them face to face, to become politically involved, is absolutely critical to keeping this issue on the forefront and to keeping members supportive of it, and those who aren't are also held accountable. But I think that when you look at it, that's the best way that we can do this. And while it's frustrating now, again, the power of the Armenian people to come forward as American citizens and ask for the government that's supposed to work for them to recognize the truth of what happened, over time will, as it did once with Reagan, bear fruit over the failed policy paradigm too many people are still working under.
So you reiterate the fact that grassroots campaigns, the ones that we see year in, year out, are effective in terms of reaching folks like you, the lawmakers?
Oh, absolutely. The Armenian community is known as one of the best at it. And I think because coming from Detroit, we see the survivors. They're older, and they're waiting for their government to stand up behind them and say, we are going to demand that the truth of what happened to you and your loved ones will not be forgotten, and it will be recognized by the government of the country where it was culpable for this. And you know that with each passing day that too many of them still don't have that sense. They don't have the gratification of knowing that the truth of what happened to them is not going to be forgotten and that it won't happen again. And so that's what I mean by grassroots lobbying. It's not just simply sitting down with a member, but just to shake the hand of a survivor, to look them in the eye, and you can see the sorrow that it comes from the fact that their own government sometimes has not stood behind them in their quest for recognition. That's the type of thing that's very difficult for someone to forget when these issues come forward.
You mentioned Turkey and how it's now looking towards the EU maybe to gain access to the West, and obviously Turkey wasn't a very good ally to us in 2003 when we tried to set up a front to Iraq through their soil. When will people in Congress, do you think, realize that maybe Turkey is not a dependable ally?
Well, as you point out, they should have recognized in 2003 when crunch time came and we needed cooperation. They weren't there. And I also remember with the Bush administration when there was the attempt to derail the genocide resolution because there was arguments that somehow Turkey would become involved in northern Iraq. That was a threat that Turkey made at the time, which also told me that if one of your allies is telling you that they're going to act against your interests because of a resolution recognizing the truth of something that happened, it doesn't make them a particularly reliable ally any more than 2003 did. But what I think a lot of members also pick up on now is the fact that despite the derailing of that resolution, they still went and did it anyways. And I think a lot of members that had flipped their position have come to regret that and have come to realize that it was absolutely the worst thing you could do, because once they gave up on the principle of the genocide resolution for the expediency of a national security quote-unquote issue, and the national security problem occurred anyways.
And Russia's now reaching out to Turkey. You're an expert in that region, and some people believe that Russia doesn't want certain connections between Armenia and Turkey. And as well, Russia recently, along with President Obama and the French president, issued a statement about the Nagorno Karabagh conflict. They wanted the parties to address whatever is in the way of the resolution. Yet, NKR, the republic, the people, are not at that table. What are your thoughts on that?
It has to be satisfactory to those individuals. It has to be satisfactory to the people of Armenia. It has to be a joint collective effort. This cannot be imposed from above. You cannot exclude parties and expect them to be content with the outcome any more than you could in the United States by passing laws and excluding people from participating at the table. My concern is with the Russians is that they still consider Armenia part of their near abroad. You've seen how Putin has acted in places such as Georgia. We've seen the former Soviet Union continuing to operate as if it was Soviet foreign policy in many of the areas. And of course, the close relationship between the United States and Armenia is something that upsets the Kremlin leaders. And I think that for us as Americans, we should remember that that relationship is critical to the United States. Not merely because we have Armenians that are Americans and want to see it, but because it's a strategic interest. The near abroad, Georgia is important to the United States, Armenia is important to the United States, the expansion of human freedom is important to the United States. So just as we would be concerned about freedom going backwards in the former Eastern Bloc, such as the Czech Republic or in Poland, we must also be the same with Armenia and Georgia and elsewhere, because otherwise the Russians will still continue to like to operate on Tsarist/Soviet foreign policy and expand their influence into those areas. And one of the attacks that was on Georgia was deliberately designed to send a chilling effect into countries like Armenia, that the bear is out of hibernation and is particularly surly these days.
Fascinating themes, and before we end this dialogue, you've got a schedule that you're trying to keep up with. I want to ask you a question about your personal life. I understand you're a musician and you play the guitar, and you Google and suddenly there's a biography of you playing in a bipartisan band with your colleagues called the Second Amendment, this band. You also met some popular Armenian rock stars, Serj Tankian and John Dolmayan, in 2006 when they came to the Capitol. What was that meeting like?
Well, it's great. They were nice, normal guys. We started talking about the MC5 because they knew Fred Sonic Smith, some of the guys. But it was a classic example of the grassroots type of lobbying.